Thank you. That's really why most people know me, so you'll get to know him in a moment. There we go. So I'm going to talk to you about something that I actually got to debut here at this event last year. And it's something that I'm pretty passionate about, having been a real fan of typography for a really long time, unable to really do much with that on the web for a very long time. So I've tried to put this in some terms that will be most relevant to all of us as web professionals, but also tie back to some important ideas about typography and how it can actually really shape and influence the message that we try and get across. So we'll talk about some dragons, we'll talk about graphic design, and we'll talk about a few other crazy things that we all get to work with on a daily basis. So this is now maybe working, maybe not. It was a minute ago. Wow, that's a bummer. Yep, really not working. I'll try plugging this one in, because I tend to wander around a lot, and it's much better when I can do that rather than have to stand still. Let's see. There we go. Quick change. Okay. It's always good to have the backup. You have to have the backup to the backup. I'm a web typographer. 2 weeks ago, I was at a type design conference up in Montreal, actually. I'm from just outside Providence, Rhode Island, so up is here to me. And saying that in front of a bunch of people who have, like, collectively centuries of experience designing type gave me a little bit of angst. Here it just sounds kind of odd, but I think what's important for me is when I talk about web typography, it's very specific. It's not general typography. It actually has some very specific connotations and constraints that are relevant to us building digital products and platforms. So I think to explain some of those concepts better, we'll go back to the people, the reason why people actually know who I am, which is the guy that walks Tristan on the left. But Tristan now has a pal hanging out with him. Her name's Tilly. We adopted her back in January. She's actually Tristan's cousin. Tristan's 9. We've had him since he was about 4 months old. Completely adorable. But I thought that because of their differences in size, it might give me a good way to talk to you about some typographic terms like width, or weight, X height, or slant. Those are all terms that are relevant to describing the type that you're putting on screen, and they so happen to tie into the things that you can vary in a variable font, among others. So most of the web is words. It's the stuff that I'm going to be talking about. Variable cat videos would be different. One of the things that I tend to do is spend a lot of time on our morning walks kind of thinking about those differences between regular and web typography and how this impacts what we do and how I can explain the value of type in the context of how we build performant web systems, and think back to what we've learned about typography so far. So going back hundreds and hundreds of years to the way things were created by monks back in the 14th century, or when things started to get printed on a press, there was a lot of skill and attention to detail that went into conveying the message that the words spell out. Coming forward again into some of the details that we see in the printed book. This is a copy of Moby Dick illustrated by Rockwell Kent. Basically, this really beautiful initial capital from Keith Houston's book about book design. Initial capitals, section marks, that sort of emphasized first word. These are all ways to amplify the message and start to bring people into a story in a way that is more than just the letters on the page. Another couple of things that I really enjoyed in this book were, notice how the F and the I connect together in that ligature, or they've got this separate style for the first paragraph from the rest, so it helps bring you into that narrative. Proper quotation marks. That's something that has been a solved problem on the web for a while, and unfortunately is not something that a lot of people really put some thought into implementing those fixes. So you end up seeing some things that really kind of run counter to that and undo it in ways that are kind of disappointing. But this phrase is something that really resonates to me. And when I tweeted this a couple weeks ago, I was really surprised and happy with the reaction that got from people. It ended up getting retweeted quite a bit. And every time we just say, nah, it's all right, it'll be fine. We sort of peel away a little bit of that veneer, a little bit of that polish about how we communicate. And because we're communicating so much more frequently in digital platforms, in ebooks and websites and mobile apps, we're in danger of losing all of the power and sophistication of communication that we have been learning and refining over the past 500-600 years since we started actually printing things on paper. This was an article online, of course, on the Atlantic website back in December of last year. And you see this all the time. In the U.S., there's a morning NBC news show called The Today Show, and in their lower third in the graphics, they have these straight up and down hash marks for quotations all the time. And it really drives me nuts. I mean, there's been a module for Drupal out there and a plugin for WordPress that actually fixes this that's been around for almost 10 years. You turn it on, and it just works. It fixes your apostrophes and your quotation marks, and it gives you proper typography. We don't have to be lazy about this. So I go back to Turner Reservoir, take a few more deep breaths, and start to think about how we can just educate people a little bit more to build these things into their frameworks. It doesn't have to be something that you start from scratch every time. So it starts with defining what good typography is and working with a designer, working with somebody, or just yourself, going and reading up on it a little bit, trying to decide what are the things that matter. So things like quotation marks, proper hyphenation, open type features like ligatures, or those proper fractions, things like that, or initial capitals. Those are all nice features of typography. You don't have to use them all the time, but they're all things that are pretty easy to implement and implement in a sustainable way that will work every time you add new content. So they're things that don't require adding additional classes to your markup and all that sort of thing. So get a good framework in place, and it always just kind of works. Now, the talk is about variable fonts, not just about what you decide is good typography, but that's really sort of the first dragon that I think is worth slaying, is the fact that there's a whole bunch of people in this room, and I'm willing to wager, if I ask how many of you studied graphic design, there's not going to be a ton of hands that go up. Anybody? That's actually more than I was expecting, and that's awesome. So the people that studied graphic design are very much in the minority in the web design world, because a lot of people just kind of find their way in. It's a really open community. It's fantastic that way. But without that understanding of what is typography, how do you set type together? How do you come up with a good readable line length? What's a good distance between lines of type? Those things you have to learn along the way. What we want to do is actually make sure that everyone has that baseline level of education about how to work with type, and make sure that we can figure out what we can do, what we can control, and what we can't. So when I started working on the web, it looked a little different than it does now. So some of the things like this. That's pretty much what the first web pages that I worked on looked like, because back in 1994, that's all you could do. It was going to be times. At the time, there wasn't even an Arial yet. It was just whatever was installed on the user system. Eventually, things got really fancy, and we were able to put a maximum width and then start to specify some other typefaces. So we're starting to implement a little bit of greater readability and typographic techniques. We eventually got to the point where we could use web fonts and start to incorporate finer touches in typography that really help kind of develop a more sophisticated visual system. This is another sample page that I worked on that shows things like those nice initial caps, the ligatures, proper quotation. Excuse me. Knew that was going to happen. Proper quotation marks. A few other things like those little, the hyphenation, the section marks, the initial first line in the line of text after the section mark. Those are all touches that can be built into your CSS so that every time you flow in new copy, like whether it's in WordPress or Drupal or any other content management system, all of those things are inherited. And there are also things that can be then selectively overridden, for example, in German, where the hyphenation dictionaries aren't as good. You can turn off the hyphenation there. So these are all things to think about in developing a good typographic system in a more sustainable way. And also think about what that mobile experience is going to be like. So this is another thing that I've written about and talked about quite a bit, is tailoring the size of your headings in relation to the body copy based on screen size. Really helps convey the importance but also maintain readable line lengths and a nicer, more tailored experience on the small screen. So this is all different renderings of different screen size shots of the exact same page. So we can create a good typographic system, but the problem is that requires an awful lot of font files, because every single one of those different widths and weights is a single different file that has to be loaded. So this is dragon number 2, performance. Because inevitably what happens whenever a designer comes in with this beautiful design, the developer is going to look at that and say, you're loading 14 font files, it's going to be a massive download, there's no way this is going to fit in our performance budget, this has to go. And honestly, rightly so. Maybe not completely, but it really is irresponsible to overload a page with a ton of font files when you could convey the message in an interesting and compelling manner with fewer of them, as long as you're keeping that in mind during the design process. So things like this are really important to keep in mind, because if you have been doing a lot of development that has anything to do with web fonts, you'll know that 3 seconds is an important number, because quite often, if a web browser is waiting around for web fonts to load, it doesn't show any content at all for guess what? 3 seconds. You just lost half your audience waiting for those fonts to load. So there is a real problem in balancing the availability of the fonts, getting the design right, and then still having an experience show up. So to do that page, I threw every single weight and variant of open sans in there that I could find. It's 549K, and it was about 18 files. Now, it made for a nice variety in visual language, but it certainly doesn't make for a quality experience for the end user when they're on a small mobile device waiting for all this stuff to download on a crappy connection on the subway. All of those things are very normal, real-world things. So this is what happens. We pare back the design, we simplify things, we load fewer files. A lot of people may look at the difference between those two and think that's fine. And in some cases, maybe it is, but we've lost a little bit of our voice and a little bit of the differentiation that we might otherwise be able to achieve. So there's a balance here that needs to be struck. This is a really important number. Variable fonts substitute all of those different font calls with a single file, maybe 2. That's a real number. Open Sans served over 26 billion times last week. Think about that amount of bandwidth across that network. I mean, that's kind of amazing to think how much is being served there. Now, on average, there's 1 or 2 on a given page, but it also could just as easily be a lot more. But also think about if it's Google Web Fonts, it's going to be cached when you're loading it from the same CDN all over the place. So you, the user, might see Open Sans on 5 different sites, and you could conceivably be only loading 1 file. So that's a better experience for you and saves a few bucks for somebody who is serving the file. So last year, 3 weeks before I came here, at ATypI in Warsaw, which is a type and typography conference, the variable font format was introduced. Really kind of blew my mind as a designer and a fan of good performance on the web, seeing what those implications are. And immediately started thinking about how I might be able to incorporate that in what I was talking about, thinking about, and speaking about. So I got the demo literally 2 nights before I came here, looked at some stuff on stage. It was really fun. It didn't actually catch on fire, so that was even better. So this is getting into looking at, let's see, in this case, that is normal page, loading 26 files. So this is using SON 600K to get that whole layout. Change that over to Lovett from CJ Dunn. It's an experimental font that he's working on in the variable format. 2 files. That's kind of awesome. So thinking about all of that being produced, the italic is one file, the Roman is the other. That beautiful display and the initial cap and the body copy is coming from the same file. All we're doing is changing the weight, changing the width. That's it. It's really kind of amazing what you can do with it, and it's all controllable via CSS. And animatable, too, by it. So that's kind of awesome. We've sort of dealt with our design language and the expansion of our vocabulary, in addition to dealing with performance, all with this one improvement. So that's really pretty remarkable. And that's not even the whole story, because we can also do things like in this page where we start to play around. Let me back up for a second. So on this page, this one is typeset in Gimlet from David Jonathan Ross. So it's another one that has a number of different axes of variation. So that's replaced everything that we had in the previous version with just a single file. And I think the current file size that I've gotten from him for this was about 40K. Now, that's not everything. I mean, they still have some work to do. I imagine that you'll see really good ones in the 50 to 100K range with a number of different axes of variation and all the open type features and things like that. But when you think about what that's replacing, that's a pretty powerful 100K that you might be downloading if you can replace so much other stuff. So to give you a more visual explanation of what's going on, with these, if you watch this animation, this is actually recorded out of a browser. This is on the Axis Praxis website, and I'll have a link to that later on, where you can kind of play around with this stuff a little bit. So that's just animating through a bunch of different axes of variation in that one file, right in a web browser. This is something that's tremendously powerful. Now, that I'm sort of paraphrasing something from about 80 years ago, about type being the clothes our words wear, but think about how much more you can say when that clothing can be anything you want in your wardrobe. So it does bring us to a third thing to consider, and any Game of Thrones fans out there know you can't forget the third dragon. It was much better when I gave this talk when it was actually on the night of the finale a few weeks ago. That really got some laughs. So because this can be tailored with CSS, we can do some pretty interesting things based on screen size. So that's that same page in the small screen view using standard fonts, and then we kind of play around with this a little bit with Gimlet. And if you notice, as this gets smaller, those characters are getting narrower. And I have some other examples of this too. When you take a look at Moby Dick here, notice in German on the right-hand side, look at the rag on the right down there. There's a lot of gaps, and it looks a little uneven, maybe a little bit hard to read, because the words in German are just on average about 40% longer than they are in English. On a small screen, typically, you only get between 30 and 40 characters per line, so it makes for a somewhat choppy reading experience. Well, if we narrow those characters just slightly, it's not that perceptible from a readability standpoint. You're really not making it harder for people to read, but you just added about 10 characters per line. So it did something in English, giving you a longer line length that makes for a smoother reading experience. And in German, it also evened out the rag on the right so that it just gave a more aesthetic appearance as well. That's pretty powerful. That's an interesting thing that you can do. There's also something, I don't know if you noticed that shift. It got a little bit more contrasty. We modified the grade. So the grade of the text is the thickness of the strokes and the characters. And by altering the grade, you can increase the contrast between foreground and background without reflowing the text. So think about that in ambient light. Lower ambient light, you can automatically increase the contrast on the text, or provide a UI control for people with low vision. So we can address a lot of interesting accessibility concerns with this as well. So becoming device and context aware and reactive to individual users' needs really challenges the notion of what typography is and takes it quite a bit further. And I think that's really one of the most compelling things about this, is that yes, we can design more and we can have a freer level of expression and it loads faster, and those are all great things, but making a compelling individualized experience, I think that's really powerful and really fascinating to see where we can go with that. So we've chained up our dragons, we've kind of solved a lot of stuff, and that's pretty awesome, but I did mention the whole future thing. So I don't want to forget that there's still something more. And that's really worth talking about. Take a look at these news sites. So I'm going to go through a few different ones here, and I'm willing to wager that you won't really be able to identify more than one or two of them. And these are the top 8 or so news websites in the world. So what's happened is that we've spent all our time optimizing our process to design universal layout and typographic systems for these large-scale content management environments, and we can pump any content we want in the world in there, and they just work. And it really kind of takes the individuality out of it. Whereas if we go back to what these monks were working on, they didn't go with good enough. That was never okay. Typography is about more than that. It's about design, it's about communication, and it's about intentionality. It's about making conscious decisions about not just any content, but also this specific content. That's a really important distinction. So we go back and look at some newspapers in print and look at all the different sizes and shapes of lettering they're using to give you cues about what is important and what is the hierarchy of these stories to get your attention around that printed page. You can see it again over here and here and here. So all of these different typographic styles have a reason for being. They're about guiding your attention to the top story, and then the next one, and then the next one. And there's a very clear intentionality to it based on very specific headlines, not just any headline. So why not get graphic design back in the room? Instead of thinking about it just purely at the beginning, before you've ever put any content into the system, let's think about how might we bring design back in later in the process. Because what happened before is somebody would write some text, there would be an editor, and then a designer would lay it out. And that's how you get these really remarkable print layouts that are really quite beautiful. What ended up happening on the web was we turned things around. Because it's so hard to keep up with putting content on the web, we had to create things in systems. And that does make a lot of sense, but it's not the only thing that we should be concerning ourselves with. So this is great to create that system, one system for everything. It's not so great for creating really unique, compelling content. So why don't we turn it around again? We've got variable fonts that are being loaded, so it's a single asset, maybe two, and we have a content management system. How might we think about bringing those things together? Jason Santamaria did this experiment. It's got to fall again. Jason Santamaria did this experiment a few years ago where he decided he wanted to art direct each blog piece. And they're absolutely beautiful and incredibly unique and completely unsustainable. There's no way he could keep up with it, so he gave up and he went back to a different design. And that was really unfortunate, but also completely understandable. ProPublica also does a really beautiful job typesetting and designing specific layouts for specific articles, but they too end up having to hit a reset button every time they want to publish a story like this. They literally have to check a button in the content management system that says, don't load anything from the content management system, here's your HTML and CSS. And it's brilliant and just crushingly disappointing all at the same time, because that's not what the system should be about. The system should be supporting the design flexibility, not circumventing it. So I wanted to think through how we might be able to do that a little bit better. Since we have these tools at our disposal, we could think about something a little bit different. So what if in our content management system we could highlight some text, hit a button, just like we do with making something bold, and decide how bold? Or modify other axes. So if we hit that button and it opens up a panel kind of like this, that displays all the axes of variation for a given typeface and actually builds it right into the tool. So maybe this isn't something that you want to expose to any author. Maybe you actually have a separate role in your CMS where somebody else is publishing text and then somebody else in the design role can go in and do something specific for, say, the headline or promotional blocks that might be sitting in the sidebar. I mean, I thought that might be a really interesting way to go, so I built it. And I'm going to show this to you live in a moment, but just in case the demo completely flames out, I want to show you what's going to happen. So this is something that I built in Drupal. It's using a couple of the variable fonts that people have given me to play around with. And that promo block on the right is one where if you hit Edit, you can go in and go into one of these variable font lines, and it exposes all of these sliders, and you save it, and you get something that looks different. So that notion of building up something that is a little bit more tailored, or a little bit more unique, and speaks a little bit differently with a different cadence and a different variation is something that, in a few hours I sort of knocked up a proof of concept, but you can see where that's going, turning it into more of a plug-in approach. All it's doing is writing out a little style sheet. That's it. It's really quite simple. So let's take a quick look. I think we've got some time. So I'm going to flip over, and then we'll come back because I've got a little bit more I want to talk about with regard to support. So this is the demo site that I put together, and I'll zoom in a little bit so you can see things a little bit better. So let's see what's going on here. This is sort of a basic installation of Drupal 8. So it doesn't really have any modules installed, just a couple in there to support a little bit of this stuff. And then it's a very simple theme, and we've got, we've got Lovette from CJ Dunn there. We've got Gimlet over there on the right from David. And this one right here, that one I just got today from Microsoft. And that is shipping in Windows 10 this fall. Variable font support in the name of Bondschrift is the name of that particular typeface. So let's go into one of these articles. So I'm going to click on this link over here, and we go in, and if I wanted to make a change here, I decide that really that's way too much emphasis. I'm totally overstating the value of this individual blog post, which is not uncommon. And hit Edit. This is the line that I want to change. Here's our sliders. So the width is kind of cranked down a little bit. The weight's way up. Let's just switch them around, and I'll just go ahead and save that. That's a little different. So this isn't huge. This isn't really offering every possible width or weight or axis of variation, but the concept of being able to think through building the design tools into the publishing process is really very accessible now. And if we wanted to go in and edit that again and even change the typeface, if you have, and I just made a select menu that lists them. I know what I have defined in the @fontface file. So if I wanted to change it from Gimlet and change it over to another one of David's options that he gave me to play with, called Output Sans. So change it again. So that's what I wanted to show working in the browser, but I also want to talk about the support, because this is something that was completely experimental 12 months ago. It's now something that is shipping fully supported here in iOS 11. They shipped full support for variable fonts built right into the OS. It works in Firefox. It works in Safari. Chrome is coming very shortly. So I'm going to flip back over here for a minute. So our status check on support with this experimental technology that is really quite new is remarkably good. So it is available now in iOS. It will be baked into High Sierra when that releases, I think this coming week. Mid-October, I've heard the 17th, Chrome will be shipping with it on by default. Currently, if you enable experimental web platform features, it works on both Mac and Windows. And then the Edge team and Firefox, I believe, I'm not 100% certain about Firefox, the Edge team is committed to supporting @FontFace by the end of 2017. And this right down here is a screen grab from what I just showed you in Windows 10. It's currently available in their preview release. That variable font file is something like 26K or something like that. I mean, it's ridiculously small. The only thing that one's offering is a weight variation, but I can also show you the Axis Praxis site where it kind of demonstrates a whole bunch more. So the CSS syntax is going to be tied right into a lot of stuff that we already work with: font weight, font stretch, font style. There's also font variation settings, which allows you to access all of them. And there's a bunch of stuff that I've put up just last week on GitHub that will give you a whole bunch of sample pages, and then I'm hosting the variable fonts so that you can play around with it and take it for a test ride yourself. So we have links on the right, slides. Previous versions are already up. I'll have these up as soon as we're done here. The code, that link, bit.ly/jpvfdemos, gets you a repository of all of the sample pages that I was just talking about, a lot of the Moby Dick pages that I was showing you in here and there. You can find out a little bit more about Tristan and Tilly if you want to follow me on Instagram at @jpamental and see their adventures every morning. And I think we've got about 10 minutes for questions or showing more demos. Thank you.